Folks, as we get started, let's ask God's intervention and protection on the people of Appomattox and whoever else may have been affected by the violent weather that just went through. Gracious Father, as we sit here safe and comfortable in your house to study your word, we are keenly aware that some of our near neighbors are suffering great loss right now. And we particularly remember the Central Baptist Church family in Appomattox whose place of worship was destroyed in the storm just a few hours ago. And we pray for your intervention and that you would use this circumstance to magnify your holy name. May your people respond in compassion and caregiving in a way that will honor you. And may the congregation at Central Baptist be able to quickly recover from this terrible loss. And now, Father, we ask that you would guide us as we study John 18 tonight. May this powerful passage not only instruct us, but may it help us to become more like the Holy Son of God, whose arrest and trial is recounted in these powerful verses. In Jesus' name, amen. With the close of chapter 17, the lengthy discourse that Jesus had with his disciples came to an end, and we pick up the story in chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kedron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered again, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" In short order, three prophetic predictions that Jesus had already made are fulfilled. Judas' betrayal, Peter's denial, and the fact that all of the disciples would flee and scatter. In this chapter, we see a sketch of some legal hearings before both Jewish and Roman officials. The entire chapter just simply records the inevitable steps that led Jesus to the cross. After their meal together, after Jesus' words of comfort to them, they left Jerusalem under cover of darkness. Again, to get the setting clear in your mind, you need to remember that this is nearly 2,000 years ago. And even in the largest cities of the world, and at that time the largest city was Rome, when it got dark outside, it got dark in the cities. This is something that if you were transported in time, back in time to the world before the advent of gas streetlights, the thing that would be most striking to you, I think, in the evening would be just how very dark it is. We live in a world in which artificial light rules the night, to the point that astronomers bemoan light pollution. There are very few places on the earth now where you can truly see the Milky Way in all its grandeur unless you're a couple hundred miles out to sea, because everywhere you go just about, at least in the distance, there is light. It would have been very dark in Jerusalem. And in those days, when it got dark, people went to bed early. I mean, wasn't a lot you could do. A little oil lamp and maybe an open fire over a brazier would be all the light there was in the house, and outside there was none at all. So the darkness hid things. The darkness was equated with danger for people because, those who were up to no good could take advantage of it. Well, they would have easily slipped out of town, in other words. And they crossed the Kedron Valley. This was in the Middle East they call them wadis. We'd think of it as a dry creek bed. It only had water flowing in it during the rainy season. The rest of the time it was just a rocky, gravelly surface. They slipped across into an olive grove that we've come to know as the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a favorite gathering place for Jesus and his disciples. That's not unexpected. If you're looking for a place to get away from the crowds, to get a quiet place of retreat, place where you and your comrades could share quietly. For Jesus and his disciples, this was better than Starbucks is for us today. and a much more worshipful kind of atmosphere. You can see the beauty of God's creation around you and get away from the city for a little bit. Judas was well aware of Jesus' habit of going there. It doesn't say in the text, but Jesus may have even alluded to the fact during the meal before Judas left that, after the meal, let's go over to the garden for a while. So John doesn't go into what is recorded in some of the other Gospels about Jesus' fervent prayer time there in Gethsemane. He cuts right to the reappearance of Judas. Judas, we'd last heard from him in chapter 13, verse 30. Now he comes, and he comes with help. The band of soldiers specifically would have referred to Roman troops. The officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees would have been the temple guard. Now you remember earlier in John, the high priest had sent some of the temple guards to arrest Jesus, and they came back empty-handed. Well, this time they're not taking any chances. They've got some battle-hardened Roman soldiers here to go and make sure that their orders are carried out. The Romans were stationed in the Antonia fortress, which is just off the northwest corner of the temple grounds. So it would have been a very simple thing for Caiaphas to send a runner over to the fortress and say, we need a detachment of soldiers, we've got somebody to go arrest. They had that kind of a close working relationship on day-to-day kinds of issues. They were armed, and this would certainly not be surprising. You wouldn't have seen a group of Roman soldiers out there in the Jewish countryside unarmed, even if they were just out for a walk, because these guys were incredibly unpopular. They were occupying soldiers, and they were about as popular as Germans in Paris were in 1943. And there was always bubbling just below the surface a seething pool of anger and resentment, and there were all kinds of groups out there who were just looking for an opportunity to get themselves a Roman. So, armed Roman soldiers, nothing unusual about that. And after all, they are going to make an arrest. They come upon Jesus and his followers there in the garden. Remember, it's dark. Assuming it was a clear night, if there wasn't a moon, the starlight would have barely given enough light to identify big dark shapes. Even if there was a full moon, it would have been dim. And because it was Passover, there was a moon. So if it was clear, you had a moonlit night. But you can't identify people in a shade of a darkened, we're in the shade of the olive trees. So they're coming, let's say it is completely clear. In the open, full moon, in a nice clear atmosphere, you can get around pretty good. But you go under those trees, man, it's like going into a cave. So that's what the soldiers are seeing as they approach Jesus and his band. And they hear a voice coming out of the darkness. Whom do you seek? Now, remember again who we're dealing with. We're talking about an occupying force of enemy soldiers going out to arrest a guy who, the charge was insurrection. That's what they were trying to sell to Pilate. So, they're looking at this guy, as a zealot, somebody that's liable to try to kill him. So they're going to be on their guard, literally. And they hear a voice in the darkness. And so their ears are listening, their eyes are straining to see in the darkness. They're on edge. And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. Now they had to say it that way because Jesus was a very common name in first century Judea. And so they wanted to identify which Jesus. And Nazareth at that time was a little village, and so the chances of there being two Jesus from Nazareth in the Garden of Gethsemane that night were pretty slim. And what does Jesus do? He says, I am he. Then something really odd happens. They drew back and fell to the ground. Why? Why would they have done this? Well, there's a couple different theories. If you read in John Calvin's commentary, he relates this to the great power that Jesus has. And that when he says, I am he, he's not just saying, it's me, fellas. But he's using a phrase that carries with it the idea of the name of Almighty God. I am. And according to Calvin, Jesus saying those words in that circumstance, hit these guys like a hurricane wind and literally knocked them off their feet. That is a possibility. Another explanation is that given the circumstance, given the fact that these soldiers were on edge, expecting trouble, that voice from the darkness saying that would have been perceived as a threat. And so from a defensive standpoint, tactically, they would back up and maybe go, kind of go down on one knee with their spears forward, anticipating a sword stroke. They want to make sure the sword goes high. That's also a possibility. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. What is clear is that Jesus is in command of the situation. So much so that he takes advantage of that and he capitalizes on their hesitation to negotiate the release of his followers. Jesus doesn't allow them to be swept up with some big dragnet. They're able to go free. Then we have a little sword play. Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. The sword in question, we're not talking about William Wallace's broadsword here. We're not talking about some Civil War cavalry saber. We're talking about what amounts to a long, Bowie knife type of weapon. A blade probably no more than a foot to maybe as much as 18 inches. The kind of weapon that you can hide under your cloak. The kind of weapon that somebody would be able to pull, depending on their motivation, either for protection when suddenly accosted or in order to attack somebody unawares. So Peter drew out a sword. And there was at least one other sword mentioned. Not in John, but over in Luke 22:38. Two swords were identified. So Peter and somebody else was armed that night. Now you got to hand it to Peter. Here he is up against a detachment of battle-hardened Roman soldiers. These guys are not pushovers. This was, to pull out your little short sword and suddenly declare war on a detachment of Roman soldiers took courage. And Peter certainly demonstrated it. He had said that he was prepared to lay down his life for Jesus, and now he's demonstrating that he meant it. This is one of those places, and there's several of these in John 18, where there are little details that point to the fact that this is eyewitness testimony. The guy who wrote this was there. And he said the servant's name was Malchus. Now, we don't know anything else about Malchus anywhere in Scripture, in any other written documents of the period. There are a few totally unsubstantiated traditions, but Malchus is just a name. And the fact that he has a name, obviously the man had a name, but why is it recorded? Who cares? Name could have been George for all we knew, and for all the difference it would have made. Except that it's just one indication that, the guy who wrote this was there. What is not included in this account is included in Luke 22:41, because after Peter lopped off his ear, Jesus touched it and healed it.
The physician.
The physician. Now, let's try to reconstruct what happened. You're a CSI investigator here. How did his ear get cut off? I guarantee you, Peter was not aiming for his ear. My reconstruction of the event is that Peter was aiming to cut his head off. And Malchus saw the blow coming and he ducked, but he didn't get down quite far enough, and the ear got taken. That is how I'd reconstruct it. Peter certainly wasn't just trying to wound. He was trying to kill these people. And then his courage is rewarded with a mild rebuke. Jesus put an immediate halt to what was going on, which no doubt saved Peter from being cut to pieces by these battle-hardened Roman soldiers. Because I guarantee you, as soon as they saw that glint of steel flashing, every one of them pull their swords. And it could have ended real bloody for all concerned. Peter said, Jesus basically said, stop it right there. Enough of this. And he says, put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? The cup, as Jesus uses it in this context, is a symbol of the outpouring of God's wrath. In that sense, it is used repeatedly in the Old Testament. In Psalm 78:8, in Isaiah 51:17, in Jeremiah 25:15, in Ezekiel 23:31 through 34, it is a very well-established common metaphor in the Old Testament. The outpouring of the cup of God's wrath. It's like taking a cup of Drano and pouring it down the drain to clean out the clog. It's caustic. It burns. It destroys. And that is the image of God's wrath being poured out on sin. Jesus is saying to Peter and all those who are listening, he has to endure that. He's got to take that cup and drink it dry. He must die for others to furnish all of us refuge from the sentence of death under which we live apart from the redeeming blood of Jesus Christ. Peter's zeal was laudable but misguided. He still didn't get it. He still did not understand what this was all ultimately about. Jesus had tried to explain it. It simply was too much for him to take in. And he had to be reminded here that his role as a disciple is to further his master's aims, not to dictate by impulsive action another course. So we continue in verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Annas was the former high priest. He had served as high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. And he was still the power behind the office. After he served, it was his sons, 5 different sons, and his son-in-law Caiaphas, who served in his place. But they were taking orders from Annas. Now, you need to understand, the office of the high priest in first century Jerusalem, we're not talking an arrangement like the papacy today. You know, when a pope is elected as head of the Catholic Church, he serves until he dies, or in the extraordinary case most recently, until he steps down voluntarily. The high priest office in Jerusalem was a political as well as a religious office, and the Roman governor controlled it. You did not serve as high priest without the Roman governor's permission. So it had become very politicized. It had not always been that way. And you go back to the early years of Judaism, Aaron and his sons and others, you know, it was an office that, you know, you inherited. You were born of the tribe of Levi, and you were in the priestly line, and it, you know, it was sent from father to son, and it was a lifelong commission. But this is not a free Jewish state. This is a Jewish state living under Roman rule. And the Romans were wise enough to understand that in this culture, the position of the high priest carried incredible power and influence with the people. And the Romans were not about to let just anybody have that kind of influence. So they put their man in the office. And if somebody wasn't towing the line, they'd pull him out and put somebody else in. Now there was the concession that the person had to be qualified under Jewish law to serve as a high priest. They couldn't put, somebody from the tribe of Judah in there. They couldn't, it had to be somebody from the Levitical tribe. It had to be somebody who met the specific qualifications. They couldn't put somebody in there that had an eye gouged out in a battle. Somebody that had a physical deformity, because that wouldn't have followed the law of Moses. But within those parameters, the Romans felt quite free to pick and choose whoever they wanted. So they got people who were wealthy, who were influential, and because of their position, they had a lot to risk. They wanted somebody for whom it was in their personal best interest to keep things nice and cozy with Rome. Because the messy thing about revolutions is everybody's house can get burned down. You think about what was going on in Virginia in 1776, 1777, when people like Washington and Jefferson and Madison risked everything, and they had a lot to risk to agree to participate in this revolt against Britain. And that was one of the distinctive features about the American Revolution that is very different from many other revolutions in other countries that have happened since then. The more typical pattern that you see is, the peasants revolting in some Central American country against the people with power and influence. And so the Romans played it smart. They wanted people that had a vested interest in keeping the peace. Because even though they would have much preferred to have been in charge themselves, they had a pretty good arrangement with the Romans. And that's what Caiaphas was talking about earlier when he said it's better for one man to die than for a revolution to get started, and we risk everything. So these are cynically practical people. Annas had no authority as a former high priest. No official authority, but he had tremendous authority of influence. And so what we see here is an attempt to short circuit things, to quickly cut to the chase with this Jesus. And so they bring him before the old man, who tries to intimidate him into self-incrimination. But in the meantime, there's another drama going on. And this is, John, he could have written scripts for Hollywood dramas. You think about a television drama. I don't know what you watch. About the only one Joyce and I watch is Blue Bloods. And it's one of the few shows, and I can think back over 30 years, and this is one of maybe 2 or 3 shows that I've ever bothered to watch when it actually is on. The last time I did that, I think, was MASH. So don't watch a lot of television shows. But, in Blue Bloods, as in most dramas, you've got 2 or 3 different storylines that you're following at the same time. There's this story going on here, there's this story going over there, and as you watch it, you weave back and forth as you follow all of them, and a lot of times it all comes together in a nice, neat bow at the end. Well, we see something like that happening here. On the one hand, we've got the drama going on of Jesus before his accusers. And at the same time, in another area of the building, we've got Peter dealing with his accusers. And the contrast in how the two men handle the interrogation that they go through is striking. And that's by design. So, Jesus is about to be interrogated. In the meantime, out in the courtyard, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Okay, these verses raise some interesting questions. The first is, who is this other disciple? He's never named. There is considerable tradition that he is John, but we can't say that with absolute certainty. One of the reasons that it is assumed that it is John is the habit that John has throughout the gospel of never naming himself. And so we see the reference to the beloved disciple there during the Last Supper. Again, it's not identified as John, but it is overwhelmingly believed, and probably in all likelihood it was John. And it may well be John here. I'm inclined to believe it is. But whoever it is, a puzzling question arises from this. This person was known by and knew Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, that seems in our world, in our stratified social register, highly unlikely. A fisherman up in Galilee who is recognized and known by name to the high priest down in Jerusalem. Can that really be? Well, don't superimpose on the first century Jewish world your personal and present expectations about who knows who. That may well be a false assumption to make. Remember that in Judaism, particularly in those days, a part of your preparation for the priesthood was to learn a trade. You would learn the job of a carpenter or a fisherman. Remember Paul? He was a leather worker, made leather tents. And he was a highly trained, formally trained rabbi. But that was the tradition. And even into modern times, there's been a strong thread of that among Jews. I'm not sure it's still true, but you go back even 100 years ago, a Jewish man who might have been planning and preparing for a distinguished career as a university professor or a doctor, earlier on he would learn a trade like plumber or carpenter or electrician. That was a common practice, and it goes way, way back. So it may be that at some point Caiaphas was interacting with the family of Zebedee. Remember, John is not an impoverished person. He is a member of a limited partnership, if you would. This fishing business was big enough to have hired help. It wasn't just a one-man operation. There was Zebedee, and there were Peter, James, and John, and then there were additional hired hands. So it was a successful small business. So who knows if indeed John is the guy, there's any number of ways that he might have known or become known by Caiaphas. We'll either never know or someday we can ask John himself. In any event, whether it's John or maybe it's Matthew, the tax collector, he probably would have known Caiaphas. Who knows? He is known and he is recognized by the servants as somebody that, is permitted to be there by Caiaphas and has enough influence that he can talk his friend through the gate. Because that's just what John, I'm going to call him John, that's what he does. He goes to the servant girl who's watching the gate, said, he's with me. Now, the first question arises. Now, another little detail that speaks of eyewitness memories. There was a charcoal fire because it was cold that night. No way in the world you would have ever known that had you not been there. The fact that there was a fire for light, sure, well, that seems reasonable, if you got people standing guard. But the detail, it was there because it was cold. That is a memory that is recalled because he remembered it felt chilly that night. Peter is trying to bluff his way through this. He is deliberately acting like, he's there for good reason. Had he been hiding away over in the corner, shivering in the dark, that would have raised suspicions. So he takes the bolder approach. He goes right up there to the fire like everybody else, Cold night, isn't it, fellas? Just trying to blend in. Problem is, they can see his face in the light. And maybe it's that causes the servant girl to say what she says. Maybe it's the fact that John identifies him as his friend, and she already knew that John was a disciple. The question is, you also are not one of the man's disciples, also, are you? So the also says, I already know that John's a disciple, and you're with him. Are you one of them? Now, at this point, the question seems quite innocent. And it's actually asked in a way, the grammar suggests that she expected a negative answer. You're not one of them, are you? And so Peter does the easiest thing under the circumstance. Nah, I'm not. Warm my hands by the fire. And that's the way it starts, isn't it? Most of the time, the path to a big sin starts with a little one. The little lie that eases us through an awkward social situation. We're not lying in order to defraud somebody. We're not lying in order to inflate our position. We're just lying to smooth our way through an awkward situation. And that's how this first lie sounds. Why get into it all? But it sets the course in a direction that leads inevitably to some really ugly lies. And that's the way it is. We take that first little step without really giving it much thought, with no great conspiracy in mind, but it diverts our path so that the next step is even further off the course. It's like when you're driving down the road, maybe you stay right in the middle of the lane, maybe you drift a little toward the yellow line, maybe you drift a little toward the white line. But if you start drifting too much, pretty soon you got two tires in the gravel, and at that point you're in danger of losing control. Peter just allowed it to drift a little too far. And now the gravel is spinning. So the high priest begins his questioning. He questions Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who've heard me what I have said to them. They know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is this how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. The way Jesus responds to Annas' questioning reflects that he is very keenly aware of Jewish legal procedures. First of all, Jesus realized that Annas had no authority to question him about anything. Secondly, he knew that witnesses could not be required to testify against themselves. Just as we have a right in U.S. Legal code against self-incrimination, the Jews in the religious courts of Judea had that right also. So you can't make me condemn myself. Besides, even if Jesus is willing to testify, his own uncorroborated testimony proves nothing under Jewish law. It would take the witness of someone else to back up what he said. Excuse me. So Jesus had absolutely no reason to answer that question. Jesus pointed out that everything he had done had been done publicly. In order to legally condemn Jesus, the priests had to come up with legitimate witnesses if they wished to dispense justice according to the established legal standards of the day. But we already know from other things that John has said to us that Jesus' arrest had nothing to do with illegality and everything to do with political expediency. He was going to be a sacrificial lamb in more than one way. Ultimately, we know in what way he's sacrificial lamb. But even among his enemies, they so regarded him. This was a guy who needed to die so that the Romans would stay off their back. Jesus' appeal to legal principle won him nothing but a spiteful blow in the face. But notice how Jesus responds. This fails to silence Jesus. It doesn't rob him of his composure or his dignity. He uses it as an occasion to reprove the offender. Look him right in the eye and say, why did you hit me? What did I say wrong? At this point, Annas realizes that bullying Jesus is going to get him nowhere. He knows too much to say something foolish. And if they're going to press capital charges, they're going to have to come up with something more than just dragging him in out of the garden. So, bound, he is taken to his son-in-law, the high priest Caiaphas. Back to the courtyard. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, so he hasn't been bluffed away. He's still trying to brazen it out. This time it says, they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. Now, if we compare this to the other accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see some strong parallels and a few additional insights that are helpful. In each case, it began with a servant girl. In the case of Matthew, the second question that aroused the second denial was also by the servant girl. The same in Mark. In Luke, a man asked the second question. A little later, someone else said, asked him, "You also are one of them." And Peter said, "Man, I am not." In John, the second question, he clarifies the confusion. He's getting this from more than one person. He says, "They said to him." So, first time it's a servant girl. The second time it's a servant girl and at least one other man who's sort of backing up the servant girl's question. It starts out as an innocent question, and then they start getting suspicious. Now, we can all read body language. And I think they were reading Peter's. They saw him trying to brazen it out by acting like he's just one of the crowd, but there was something false about him, and they were picking up on it. And then one of them started studying that face in the shadows and said, "I know that guy." And then finally, it becomes evident that the guy was one of those who went out to the garden, and he recognizes Peter as the guy with the sword. And it was his relative that he lopped his ear off. So at this point, the accusations are becoming very pointed. And Peter's response gets worse and worse. The first time he just denies it. The second time he denies it with an oath. The third time, as it's recorded in Mark 71, he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear. And then here's the most poignant part of all. And John doesn't tell us this, but Luke does. This last vile fisherman's oath is still hanging in the air. When Peter looks up, and lo and behold, they are moving Jesus from Annas to Caiaphas. And Peter realizes that the Lord's just heard everything he said. And at that moment, the rooster crows. And it all comes crashing down on Peter. What he has just done, what he had bragged he was going to do, what Jesus had warned that he would do. And remembering all that, he fled the area weeping bitterly. Now Jesus, they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas. John kind of skips through. If you go to the other gospel accounts, you get all the gory details of the trials. John is just trying to move us to the climax. So without going into any detail about what happened at Caiaphas, he says that then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. So Jesus has been up all night. The reason the rooster crowed was the sun's about to come up. It's those cold moments before the dawn. I can think back to a few occasions back in college and seminary when I pulled an all-nighter, trying to finish a paper, getting ready for a test. And there is something just so awful physically awful when you realize you haven't been to bed and it's starting to get light and you've lost a whole night. It's just a sickening feeling. When you're having to drive, Joyce and I make those trips to Wisconsin, we're getting up long before daylight. And it is just really hard to get and stay alert during that bleak hour before the sun comes up. And Jesus is physically exhausted. He's been through the ordeal, the emotional draining ordeal of basically saying goodbye to his disciples. He's had the horrific realization that one of them was a traitor. That kiss in the garden, being roughed up and abused all night, being, made to stay on his feet, not being able to rest, and it's just getting worse and worse. The high priest and his company would not enter the governor's headquarters. Passover was coming, and they didn't want to contaminate themselves by entering a Gentile's house. And the screaming hypocrisy of this just jumps off the page. They're willingly, knowingly about to have an innocent man put to death, and they're worried about symbolic contamination. The blood of a man is on their hands, and they're worried about the governor's cooties. And Pilate demonstrates here that he's been at this job a while. He knows how to deal with these people. He could easily have said, if they want to talk to me, they can come and see me. But he's a politician. And his job is not to throw his weight around. His job is to keep control of a very troublesome Roman province. And if that means he has to walk out to the balcony to talk to these guys, then he'll walk out to the balcony. So what accusation do you bring against this man? You can almost hear I've had to get out of bed early. This was not the way I wanted to plan my day. Come on, let's get this over with. What's the problem here? And the arrogance of their response is staggering. If this man were not doing evil, we wouldn't have brought him over here. Just stamp the execution order and let's get over this. At this point, you can almost see Pilate losing it. Take him yourself and judge him your own laws. This is your problem, not mine. And then they say it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And now the penny drops for Pilate. Oh, so you're after blood, are you? Now I see what's going on here. Because under Roman law, there was only one circumstance in which the Jewish authorities could condemn a man to death without Roman approval. And that was when a Gentile passed into the Jewish court in the temple. And there were signs at every threshold as you went from the court of the Gentiles into the court of women. And it was a capital offense, and anybody that took it upon themselves to do that took their own life in their hands, and they would be stoned on the spot. That was the one exception. Otherwise, they had to get Roman authority to execute a criminal. They couldn't come up with a violation of Roman law. But here's what's interesting. It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. He had already warned them he was going to be crucified. Blasphemy was not punished by crucifixion. It was punished by stoning. The high priest knew that. All the priests knew that. They didn't want Jesus stoned. They wanted him crucified. And they had a very specific reason. They knew that crucifixion was looked upon as a form of hanging. You can look in Acts 5:30, Acts 10:39, and in Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who hangs on a tree is accursed. They saw Jesus as a threat. He had a lot of popular support. They wanted to crush it in one fell blow. If their hero is seen being crucified, the disgraceful nature of that form of execution would be a horror to all of them, and they would say, what have we been following? It was crucial to them that Jesus killing him was too good for them. They didn't want him just killed. They wanted him discredited. They wanted him shamed. They wanted him dishonored. And the way to do that was to get the Romans to crucify him like a common criminal. Pilate would only have one reasonable reason for agreeing to crucify Jesus, and that was if he was seen as a political threat. So Pilate gets him away from his accusers, takes him inside, and are you the king of the Jews? Is that what this is all about? Just another would-be Messiah, another zealot, another revolutionary? Jesus is unexpectedly cautious about the way he responds. Now, he's been very, very forthright up to this point. He seems to be hedging a little. He says, do you say this on your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? What's this supposed to mean? If Pilate was inquiring whether Jesus was a political threat to Rome, are you just another zealot? Then the answer would be no. If this was Pilate's question, coming from the perspective of a Roman governor, then the answer is no. On the other hand, if Pilate was trying to confirm Jesus' messianic claims as he has been making them publicly, then the answer is yes. So Jesus is basically saying, what question are you asking here? And I'll give you the right answer. Am I a political threat to you? No. Am I a religious threat to the hierarchy in the temple? You better believe it. Pilate's answer is pretty curt. He cared nothing about Jewish religious squabbles, had Jesus violated Roman law or not. And so Jesus went back to the original question. You're asking about, am I a political threat? My kingdom is not of this world. Yes, I'm a king, but not in the sense that you're worried about. By not of this world, Jesus meant that his mission and his authority is derived from God, not from any earthly power, not from Rome, not from the Sanhedrin, not from anyone. It did not mean that his kingdom had no influence in the world, or that his kingdom was on a parallel track with earthly kingdoms with equal power and status. In fact, his reign was above all earthly powers. Yes, it is true, I am no threat, no immediate threat to you, Pilate, or to Rome. But I'm not under your authority or your control either. This only happens because the Father allows it. And the ultimate truth was that Jesus and what he represented would be a huge threat to Rome. Because in time it would challenge the very authority of Rome itself. Jesus says he bears witness to the truth. Pilate says, what's truth? At this point, he's bored with the conversation. Went back outside, told the Jews, I find no guilt in him. But, Passover's coming. We've got this custom. This time of year, I always release a criminal for you. Now, by the way, there's no other documentation anywhere of this custom, but it is perfectly consistent with the kind of pragmatic attitude that Rome exercised in these kind of situations. So there's no reason to believe it's not accurate. Pilate's basically trying to give him an easy way out here. He's saying in effect, all right, guys, you've overplayed your hand. You brought a guy into me that's clearly innocent. Let me give you a face-saving way to get out of this awkward situation. I'll release Jesus because it's Passover. You can go away, being able to say, yeah, he was guilty and we brought him to Pilate and we can save ourselves killing an innocent man. They're not going to have it. They've already got the crowd primed. Give us Barabbas. And the irony of it is, the very false charge that they hung on Jesus, Barabbas was guilty of. And he skates, and Jesus is crucified. And that's it for tonight, folks.